Right and wrong, good and bad, these are probably concepts, especially if you're a reader, that you've come across before. In fact, a lot of people like to read just to read about ethics, and in ethics that is a pretty popular topic, right? You get like cognitivism versus non-cognitivism, or error theorists, right? They make arguments that moral categories aren't real. You probably also run into like the is-ought distinction. Just because it is bad to do something doesn't mean you ought not to do it. Stuff like this, right? And over the years, my opinions on right and wrong or good and bad have changed pretty drastically. And I would say it was a direct result from reading, and especially in different areas. When I first started on this topic or down this road, I became a relativist pretty quickly, right? I think most people are naive realists before they become educated or exposed to this topic more explicitly. I think most people have a background assumption that morals are real and that you shouldn't be doing things that are, let's say, bad for other people, that cause harm to other people. And I think I was that in the very beginning. I would say like 16, 17, around there. Then I got into philosophy, and when I got into philosophy, I found the most persuasive arguments were actually relativistic arguments. I thought they made the most sense. The idea that, well, a culture on the other side of the planet likes to do behavior X, and they're okay with behavior X, but our Western culture, I'm Canadian, our Western culture didn't agree with behavior X, and they think behavior X is immoral. Maybe you could say in China it's okay to eat dogs, in Canada it's not okay to eat dogs. This was like a famous example. And I found that this argument, it was in fact fairly persuasive. I was persuaded by this. How else do you explain these state of affairs that went on? And so I was a relativist on this topic first and foremost. But then I went into psychology, and psychology tends to have a different take on these things. Psychologists tend to argue, usually is probably from like a neuroscience perspective as well, is that there's a biological basis to morality, that it's not just pure rationality. Human beings aren't these abstract, like reasoning things. They aren't these like pure spirits that are made of reasoning, right? That's not what humans are. Humans have brains, and brains were absolutely subject to evolution, and they're material, they're naturalistic, right? They're physical things, and they can't just do whatever they want. They obey natural laws. From that, you could argue that the moral behaviors that we do witness and do have are actually there because they were instinctually programmed. This is one way of arguing from a psychological perspective. And so from that perspective, you could argue that it's real, right? Humans in every culture tend to show like empathetic responses to someone else's pain. You show them in pain, they have these kind of empathetic responses. People don't want to be cheated across cultures. There tends to be, like if you go into, let's say, China again and go to Canada, people don't want to be cheated in their trades, right? They want fair trades. They don't want basically cheating to go on. There tends to be these universal similarities between cultures, and that might be because the human brain is similar across the planet. We're all very, very similar. We have much more in common biologically and psychologically than we do have less in common, right? There's more similarities than there is dissimilarities. So on that grounds, I kind of became a realist again, and I thought that there might be something about morality that we need to respect. It seems to be an instinct that we've developed. There's probably something real about it. And so I became into the realist camp. There was also another interesting idea that I stumbled across that I couldn't ignore, and I still can't ignore, which is if you imagine an alien species viewing humans, right, then what you would find is that they have morals. They have moral behaviors. Now, the reason why I mention this is because some people will say, well, even if there is like an instinct for humans to be good and bad, doesn't mean the categories good and bad are real, right? They're just instincts. They're not like natural categories of the world in the same way that like gravity is, okay? But if you're an alien species observing the human race, and you have a third-person descriptive stance, right? You're having a descriptive stance towards their moral behaviors, then it would be really nonsensical to say that they don't have these categories of good and bad. And so the categories of good and bad themselves are real, but the content of those categories, you could say, are probably arbitrary, although it would be hard to separate the content from the category itself, right? And so, so in that case, I would also then find that it's both ontologically real and then propositionally real, right? the moral propositions that we make seem to be based in biology. And if you do this thought experiment where you're observing an alien, or sorry, you're an alien observing humans, it seems to be that there is an ontological basis for morality as well. And so this was like my realist phase. But I since moved out of that, and one of the reasons I moved out of it was because I came into law. Now, I will say when I went into law, I didn't jump out of the realist position entirely. I actually had a different kind of breakdown of morality. I tended to view interpersonal morality between two people, as being like based on realism or psychological realism of morals. And when it came to society's morals or like systematic moral systems, I tended to be in the relativist position. Now you could say it like a sense of individualism. Maybe there's an instinct that people want autonomy, shaped the foundations of Western democracy. You could say that, but I would say by and large that the systems in place are not they're not real in the same sense that personal morals are real. They're more socially constructed. And evidence of this is that even when you have like two Western democracies, their legal systems can be completely different, and the way they interpret these things can be completely different. Legal interpretation is incredibly subjective. Concepts like reasonable man or just or unjust, these are extremely loose categories that arguably have no foundational meaning to them. You can see case law, right? If you follow if you follow common law, you can see cases where they try and treat like cases alike. That's what they tend to do in America or common law systems. But it's debatable as to how like the cases are because it's usually by analogy. And the analogy usually depends on some authority figure like a judge. And then in civil systems, you have what's called like horizontal precedent, vertical precedent. And what this means is that like authority figures determine what's precedent. And as a result, you'll have mutually exclusive precedences depending on jurisdiction. So I came to view society's morals as more relativistic and human, like personal morals, as more realist. But as time went on, I actually dumped both of these worldviews. I dumped both the relativistic worldview and the realist worldview because I became a pragmatist as a result of skepticism. So you might have heard me talk about this before, maybe you read my book, where there's this thing called the Munchausen's trilemma, which basically states that for any standard of evidence you assert as a justification for your beliefs, you can apply it to itself. So let's say the famous example for a scientific worldview is falsificationism. Well, the worldview of falsifiability or falsificationism cannot itself be falsified because it's a principle, it's a theoretical principle, it's not an empirical thing. And so it is itself not falsifiable. And if the standard of evidence that we're using is it has to be falsifiable in order to be scientific, well, falsifiability is not falsifiable, and so it's not scientific, and so we could therefore say that it's not justified by itself, and we could dismiss it, right? It's axiomatic. And this holds true for like virtually everything, including morality. Your moral beliefs will, if you have a standard of justification for them, you can apply the standard of justification to itself, and then you'll find that you can't justify that standard, and therefore you can't justify what's entailed by that standard, such as your moral beliefs. What this led me to conclude is that ultimately you don't need justification for your emotions, right? Things just happen. I don't need to like justify that I perceive apples as red. I just do. And I don't need to justify that I feel bad when people steal from me. I just do. It just happens. It's not something I infer. It's something that kind of spontaneously arises, as far as I can tell. So from that, what you could say is, well, I don't care if we say killing is immoral or illegal or whatever, right? If you don't even have an issue with killing. All I care about is that we don't do the behavior. And a lot of these ethics debates are actually debates about labeling. You'll find that people who don't believe morals exist and people who do believe morals exist, or that they're real, or that the propositions are justifiable, actually agree in the same sets of behaviors. They'll probably both agree that we should have like contracts that regulate trade. They probably both agree that theft is not something that is preferable inside your society. They'll agree pretty much on all the same behaviors. They just disagree on the like labeling or like the language around these behaviors. And so for me personally, what I've now come to is that I'm a pragmatist. If there's a set of behaviors that I want done, and in order for you to get to engage in those set of behaviors, I need to agree with your worldview for you to engage in those set of behaviors. I have no problem doing that, and I'll have no problem like code switching or switching to another worldview when I'm talking to another person, just to get them to agree to a set of behaviors. Because ultimately, the theoretical framework that you're using for your morality is as equally unjustified as your interlocutor's theoretical framework. And so what matters is the stuff that is actually happening, like the foundations of your experiences, your perceptions, right? If you don't want pain in your perception, I would argue that action is going to be more significant in the avoidance of pain than simply labeling something differently. And like 9 times out of 10, action is going to trump labeling. Therefore, I would say that, yeah, I've become a pragmatist. Whatever gets me behaviors that I want, I'm okay with. So that's kind of been my experience with right and wrong, or good and bad, and I would actually attribute this massive amount of variance directly to reading. And this happens not only with right and wrong or good and bad, even like with finance, how I value companies changes as a result of reading. Or like personality models, like how I view human psychology changes as a result of reading. This all happened because I read different books. Which, in spirit of that, if you have books to recommend me on ethics, I'm open to reading them. I don't think they'll be justifiable, but I still change my mind sometimes on some minute topics, especially like when it comes to applied ethics. I think applied ethics is probably where ethics is going to matter most. And I would also be interested in hearing if you have any counter arguments or things to say about the trilemma or your own personal experiences with right and wrong. But with that being said, bye-bye.